Spring 1971, Carmel by the Sea, California. A woman named Ruth Callahan is sitting at a kitchen table with a letter in her hand. The letter is on studio letterhead. It is 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expresses condolences. The second explains the terms of her late husband's contract. The third informs her that a check for $600 has been issued and will arrive within 10 business days. The signature at the bottom belongs to a man in the legal department whose name Ruth has never seen before. She reads the letter twice. She folds it back into the envelope. She sets it on top of the stack of bills beside the sugar bowl. Then she puts her hands flat on the table, and she stares at the wall. Here is the story. Her husband's name was Danny Callahan. He was 41 years old when he died. He had worked as a stunt coordinator in Hollywood for 17 years. He had coordinated the falls, the crashes, the fire gags, and the horse sequences on 23 pictures. He had kept men from dying on sets where careless producers had cut the safety budget to nothing. He had a reputation in the stunt community as the steadiest pair of hands in the business. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who walked a set 3 times before he let anyone near it. He had a wife named Ruth and 2 daughters, Carol, aged 14, and Diane, aged 11. He had a small house in Carmel with a blue door and a fig tree in the front yard that he had planted himself the summer Carol was born. He had been planning to retire in 4 years. He had told Ruth this on a Tuesday. He died on a Thursday. The accident happened on location in the hills east of Monterey. A vehicle stunt had been called for the 3rd time in one afternoon because the director was not satisfied with the angle. The driver was a young stuntman named Vic Holt, 26 years old and 18 months in the business. Danny had told the producer before the first take that the road surface was too loose for a controlled roll at that speed. The producer had nodded and told him they were behind schedule. Danny had gone back to his position marker. He had done his job. On the 3rd take, the vehicle rolled wrong. It came over the embankment, and Danny Callahan, who had spent 17 years keeping other men out of the way of things like this, was standing in the exact place where it came to rest. He died before the ambulance reached the road. Vic Holt walked away with a broken collarbone and a story he would carry for the rest of his life. The studio sent Ruth $600 and a form letter. They sent it 9 days after the funeral. They sent it without a phone call. The check arrived in a plain envelope with a pre-printed return address. Ruth opened it at the kitchen table while the girls were at school. She looked at it for a long time. $600. 17 years. 23 pictures. The man who planted the fig tree. $600. She put the check in the drawer with the letter. She closed the drawer. She made a cup of coffee. She sat back down at the table, and she added up the numbers in her head the way she had been adding them every day for 2 weeks. The mortgage was $212 a month. The girls had 3 more years of school between them. The car needed a timing belt. The fig tree needed nothing. It would outlast all of them and never ask for a thing. The numbers did not add up. They had not added up since the Thursday Danny died. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, Clint Eastwood was on location 6 miles from Ruth Callahan's house. He was filming a picture in the hills above Carmel, a story about a lawman coming back to a town that had forgotten what law meant. He had known Danny Callahan, not the way men know each other at parties or on award show circuits, the way men know each other on sets. Danny had coordinated one sequence on an earlier picture Eastwood had done, a difficult horse sequence on a mountain road that most stunt coordinators would have refused or delayed. Danny had walked it for 2 days, made 3 adjustments, and then delivered it on the first take, clean and safe and exactly right. Eastwood had noticed. He had said so to the director afterward. He was not a man who complimented work he did not mean. He had shaken Danny's hand at the end of the shoot and told him he was the best pair of eyes on a set he had ever seen. Danny had nodded and gone back to packing his equipment. That was the extent of it. They had not spoken since. Eastwood had heard about the accident. He had heard about it the way most people in the industry heard about it, through the production grapevine, a sentence at the end of a phone call about something else. He did not know about the $600 check. He did not know about the form letter. Not yet. What he knew was that Danny Callahan's house was 6 miles from his location base camp, and that a woman was in it with 2 daughters and a drawer full of bills. He knew this because his own location manager, a man named Pete Sorrells, had grown up in Carmel and had gone to school with Danny's older sister. Pete had mentioned it without thinking, the way people mention things that seem like ordinary information, just noting that the Callahan house was nearby and that it had been a hard spring for that family. Eastwood had been checking equipment when Pete said it. He had not looked up. He had not responded. Pete had moved on to the day's logistics, but Eastwood had heard it. And that evening, when the rest of the crew drove back to the production hotel in Monterey, Eastwood did not go with them. He told his driver he would take the truck himself. He drove out of the base camp and he turned toward Carmel instead of toward Monterey. He had the address from the crew list Danny had been on for the earlier picture. He had not called ahead. He did not call ahead. Ruth Callahan answered the door at 7:15 in the evening. The porch light was on. The girls were doing schoolwork in the back of the house. She had been washing dishes. She had soap on her hands when she heard the knock. She dried them on a dish towel and opened the door, and Clint Eastwood was standing on her porch in a flannel work shirt and a worn ranch jacket, holding his hat in both hands the way a man holds a hat when he is not certain he has the right to be where he is. He was alone. There was no driver waiting. There was no production assistant standing off to the side. He was alone on her porch with his hat in his hands and the fig tree in the yard behind him dark against the evening sky. Ruth looked at him. She had seen his pictures. She had not expected this. He said her name. He said, "Mrs. Callahan, my name is Clint Eastwood. I worked with your husband on a picture in 1969. He was the finest stunt coordinator I ever saw." She did not say anything. She had not said anything to a stranger in 2 weeks that was not about groceries or the gas bill. He said, "I would like to come in, if you'll let me. I will not stay long." She opened the door. He sat at the same kitchen table where the letter and the bills sat beside the sugar bowl. He did not take coffee. He did not ask for anything. He looked at the stack of papers on the table, and he looked at Ruth sitting across from him, and he said, "I heard about what the studio sent you." Ruth looked at him. She said, "A letter and a check." He said, "I know." She said, $600. He said, "I know." The word came out of him different the second time, not softer, harder, the way a man says a thing when he understands exactly what it means. There was a silence. The refrigerator hummed. One of the girls laughed at something in the back room. Eastwood looked at the drawer beside the sugar bowl. He did not ask what was in it. He already understood. He put both his hands flat on the table, the same way Ruth had put hers flat on the table 9 days earlier after she read the form letter. He looked at her. He said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. He said, Danny Callahan kept men alive on sets where the people in charge of keeping them alive had already given up. I watched him work. I know what that is worth. It is not worth $600 and a letter from a man in legal who never shook his hand. Ruth's eyes filled. She did not look away. Eastwood did not look away either. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he stood up. He took something from the inside pocket of his ranch jacket. It was a plain envelope, sealed, with no writing on the front. He set it on the table beside the sugar bowl. He said, "There is a note inside. Read it later, not while I am here." He picked up his hat. He said, "The other thing is this." He reached into the same pocket and brought out a key on a paper tag. He set it on the table beside the envelope. He said, "There is a building on the main road in Carmel. Used to be a dry goods store. It has been empty since February. I bought it this afternoon from the man who owns the block. The deed is being drawn up and will arrive in your name by Friday. It is a good building. Good corner, good light, close to foot traffic. What you do with it is your business. You can rent it and live on that income. You can open something. You can sell it in 10 years when it is worth twice what it is now." He paused. He said, "Danny earned a building." The studio's math was wrong. She looked at the key on the table. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She said, "Mr. Eastwood, I cannot accept this." He said, "You're not accepting it. It's Danny's. He earned it. Every take, every sequence, every road he walked twice before he let anybody stand on it." He nodded once. He said, "Good night, Mrs. Callahan." He put on his hat. He walked to the door. He opened it himself. He stepped out onto the porch. He walked down the steps and across the yard past the fig tree, and he got into his truck, and he drove away. Have you ever had someone give you something at the exact moment when the math had stopped working? Not because they had to, not because someone was watching, just because the math was wrong and they were the one who saw it. That moment does something to a person. Not just in the hour it happens. For the rest of their life. Ruth sat at the table for a long time after the truck's headlights swept across the kitchen window and disappeared. Then she picked up the envelope. She opened it. There was a note inside on plain paper, not studio letterhead, not a printed card. A handwritten note. 2 lines. It said, "He walked every road twice so nobody would get hurt. The least the rest of us can do is walk 1 road for him." There was no signature. She put the note back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the drawer where the studio letter was. She put Danny's drawer letter on top of it. She picked up the key. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a while. Then she closed her hand around it. She went to the back of the house. She looked in at the girls at their schoolwork. She did not say anything to them that night. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark on the side of the bed that was hers, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about a building on a corner in Carmel with good light and foot traffic. She thought about what Danny would say. She already knew what he would say. He would say, "You always wanted the flower shop." The building on the main road had been a dry goods store for 31 years before its owner retired and shuttered it. It had good bones, the kind of building a town builds when it expects to use it for a century. Ruth Callahan took possession of the deed the following Friday, as Eastwood had said. She walked the building on a Saturday morning with her older daughter, Carol, who was 14 and had her father's habit of noting things quietly without making a fuss. Carol walked the space twice and said, "The light is good in the afternoon." Ruth said yes. Carol said, "It's big enough for tables." Ruth said yes. Carol did not ask anything else. She had her father's understanding that some things you simply trust. Ruth Callahan opened a flower shop in that building in September of 1971. She called it Callahan's. She had no prior experience in flowers beyond the garden she had kept behind the house in Carmel since the year Diane was born. What she had was an eye for arrangement, the same eye she had brought to every corner of the house Danny had provided, and a patience with living things that did not need to be explained. The flower shop became, within its first year, the place in Carmel where people went when they needed something that mattered. Not the convenience flowers, the real ones. The arrangement for the anniversary. The wreath for the man who deserved a better one than the grocery store sold. The flowers for the wedding where the bride's mother was too proud to say she could not afford the florist on Fifth. Ruth learned where to source what the town actually needed. She drove to the flower market in Monterey herself twice a week for 4 years before she could afford a delivery arrangement. She never raised her prices more than once in a decade. She never turned away a veteran's family, a teacher, or a child who came in with a fistful of change and something important to mark. Nobody in Carmel knew where the building had come from. Ruth did not tell them. The girls did not tell them. Pete Sorrells, the location manager who had mentioned the Callahan name to Eastwood without thinking, heard about the flower shop opening and nodded to himself and said nothing to anyone for 22 years. Clint Eastwood never visited the shop. He never drove past it on his way through town and stopped to look in the window. He never sent a production assistant by with a note. He let it be Ruth's. He let it be Danny's, the way he had said it was. The note stayed in the drawer with the studio letter for 34 years. Carol found it when Ruth moved to a smaller house in 2005, and the girls helped her sort through the contents of the kitchen. Carol was 48 years old. She read the note standing at the kitchen counter with her mother's reading glasses on because hers were in the car. She read it twice. She looked up at her mother across the kitchen. Ruth was wrapping dishes in newspaper. She did not look up. She said, "Put it back in the envelope." Carol said, "Mom." Ruth said, "Put it back. It goes with the key." Carol put it back. She put the envelope and the key in the wooden box where Ruth kept the things that were not negotiable. The box came with her to the smaller house. It is on a shelf in the bedroom of that house today. Callahan's flower shop on the main road in Carmel stayed open for 31 years. The same number of years the dry goods store before it had stood there. Diane, the younger daughter, learned the business alongside her mother through high school and came back to it after 2 years of college when she understood that flowers were where her patience lived. She ran the shop with Ruth through the 90s. She ran it alone for the last 8 years before it closed, when Ruth's hands made it impossible to continue with the precision the work required. The shop closed quietly, the way good things in small towns close. A card in the window on a Monday morning, a last arrangement delivered to the church up the road. The key turned in the lock for the last time by the same woman who had turned it for the first time 31 years before, and she stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a while before she drove home. The building sold. It is a gallery now. The new owners painted the walls white and hung the work of landscape painters who had discovered Carmel from somewhere else. The corner is good. The light in the afternoons is still good. None of the paintings on the walls know what happened in the building before them. That is all right. Some buildings carry more than their current tenants can see. Clint Eastwood was never asked about Ruth Callahan. No journalist ever connected his name to the building on the corner in Carmel. The deed was clean. The title transfer was a matter of county record, available to anyone who looked. But no one thought to look. The location manager, Pete Sorrells, gave a single interview to a small industry journal in 1993 about the changing economics of location shooting in California. Near the end of it, the interviewer asked him about memorable moments from his years in production. Pete thought for a moment. He said there was one evening in Carmel in the spring of 1971 when the director he was working with drove a truck away from base camp alone and came back 3 hours later without saying where he had been. He said he had always had a feeling about what that evening was. He did not say more. The interviewer moved on to another question. The journal had a circulation of 400 people. The interview was never reprinted. Vic Holt, the stuntman who walked away from the accident that killed Danny Callahan, retired from the business in 1984. He moved to a small town in Oregon. He never worked on a set again. In 1987, he drove to Carmel and walked into the flower shop on the main road and asked for Ruth Callahan. Ruth came out from the back. She looked at him. She knew who he was. He stood in front of her in the middle of the shop with the afternoon light coming through the front window, and he said he had been trying to find the words for 16 years and had not found them yet, but he was going to try. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Danny never blamed the driver. It was the road and the schedule and the man who said it was fine to run it a third time." She said, "Danny would have told you that himself if he had gotten the chance." Vic nodded. He did not speak for a while. Then he bought a bunch of yellow freesias and carried them out. He drove back to Oregon. He sent flowers to the shop once a year after that for 11 years, until Diane wrote to tell him that Ruth had retired and the shop was under new management, and she thought he ought to know. He stopped sending them. He was not a man who sent flowers to strangers. Some men perform goodness where people can see it. They make sure the light catches them at the right angle. They let the story travel on its own because they have already arranged for it to travel. Other men do it in the evening, alone, in a truck they drove themselves, with a key from a building they bought that afternoon before anyone thought to ask why. The difference between those two kinds of men is not complicated, but it is everything. It is the whole distance between a person who acts because he wants to be seen acting and a person who acts because the math was wrong, and he was the one who happened to notice. Clint Eastwood noticed. He drove 6 miles. He knocked on a door. He set a key on a table and said it belonged to the man who had earned it. Then he drove away. That is all. That is the whole of it. And unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who still believes that what you do when nobody is watching is the only thing that really counts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.